Welcome to the Midnight Codex, where forgotten truths breathe and shadows tell their tale. Tonight, don't blink and don't look behind you.
I didn't want to take this job, not really, but it was a lifeline, a promise of escape. And when you're desperate enough, you'll ignore the warning signs, you'll swallow the unease. But it doesn't matter now. I'm too far in. There's no turning back. I was running out of options. The bills piled up. The phone calls from creditors became a constant hum in the background of my life. My relationships were falling apart. Lisa, the girl I thought I would grow old with, had already given up on me. And I don't blame her. When you spend every waking hour lost in spreadsheets and meetings, you start forgetting what's important. You forget to breathe, forget to live. That's when the email came. Subject line: urgent security position available, immediate start. I almost deleted it. Just another scam, right? A too-good-to-be-true offer to lure the desperate, but then I saw the pay. And just like that, the hesitation vanished. It was more money than I'd seen in years, probably more than I would make in a lifetime at my current job. The details were sparse: a remote location, an ancient structure to guard, no real explanation of what that structure was or why it needed guarding. But the offer was clear. It was immediate and it was desperate. So was I. The message contained only coordinates, no name, no address, just a set of numbers leading me somewhere isolated, far from the noise and chaos of the city. No questions asked. I could disappear. I didn't even pack much. I didn't need to. It wasn't going to be a long-term thing. It was just a break. I told myself that as I threw a few clothes into the back of my car and drove away. The further I went, the less I saw of the world I knew. The streets became narrower, the trees thicker. They stood on either side of the road like sentinels, tall, ancient, their bark worn down by time, their branches heavy with dark leaves. I swear the forest was closing in around me, but I told myself it was nothing. I couldn't afford to think too much. I just had to keep driving. Eventually, I reached it. The place. There was no sign, no name, just a rusted gate standing at the end of a long gravel road, framed by an old stone archway. The gate was dark, its iron twisted and corroded, but still sturdy. It looked like it had been there for centuries. The air was thick, and even as I stepped out of the car, I felt like the place was holding its breath, waiting. A man was already standing by the gate, waiting for me. His face was hidden by the brim of a weathered hat, and his posture was rigid, military-like, as though he had been standing there for hours, unmoving. His clothes were dark, almost blending into the shadows of the night. "You're late," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, devoid of warmth. I opened my mouth to speak, but he raised a hand to stop me, then turned and unlocked the gate. Without a word, he gestured for me to follow. Inside, the building was nothing like I expected. It wasn't a facility or even a house. It looked more like an old, abandoned chapel. The walls were lined with stone, the windows were broken, and the air smelled like damp earth and decay. Dust motes floated in the faint light filtering through the cracked glass. He led me into a small, dimly lit room. A desk sat in the center, and on it, a single piece of paper. He motioned for me to sit. "Read it," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The paper was simple, aged with time, and the ink looked like it had been written decades ago, but the rules were what made my stomach churn. Rule 1: never leave the gate unguarded. It seemed simple enough. A gate to guard, a job to do. But there was something ominous in the phrasing, as if the gate itself needed more than just a security guard. It needed something sacred. Rule 2: if the bell tolls at midnight, do not look into the shadows. I frowned. A bell and shadows? This was starting to feel like some twisted fairy tale, but the words were there, and I had no choice but to keep reading. Rule 3: never make contact with the people who come to the gate. People? What kind of people would come to this remote place? And why couldn't I speak to them? What was behind that gate? Rule 4: The gate must remain locked at all times. Never attempt to open it. Locked? Why? What was beyond it that was so dangerous, so terrifying, that it had to be locked forever? I could feel the chill creeping into my bones as I read it. Rule 5. If you hear someone calling your name from beyond the gate, do not respond. That was the one that hit hardest. I had to fight the shiver crawling up my spine. The thought of someone, or something, calling my name from beyond that gate, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I looked up at the man, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring off into the darkness, as though listening to something only he could hear. "Do you understand the rules?" he asked, his tone flat, as if he had already asked this question 1,000 times before. I opened my mouth to speak, but all I could do was nod. The words felt heavy, but I dismissed them. It was just a job. Rules are always a part of the job, right? Without another word, the man stood and motioned for me to follow. We left the room, stepping into the cold air outside. The gate loomed behind us, its dark presence seeming to stretch out like a shadow of its own. "You'll start tomorrow," he said, his voice distant. "Just don't break the rules. They keep you alive." The gate felt heavier than it had the first time I laid eyes on it. It wasn't the iron or the rust. Those things were expected. It was the weight of the silence surrounding it, pressing down on me like a physical presence. The air was thick, damp, almost alive, and as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond the gate was aware of me, watching. I had been up high, told to guard it, to make sure nothing crossed that boundary. Simple enough, right? But as I stood there, the darkness stretching out before me like an impenetrable void, I realized that the task ahead wasn't as straightforward as I'd thought. The rules were not just guidelines, they were lifelines. They were my only connection to reality, to sanity. It was just me and the gate now. The building I was meant to stay in was small, like a forgotten cabin, the walls thick with the musty smell of mold and wood rot. The lights flickered now and then, dim and unreliable, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and stretch even when I wasn't moving. There was a desk with a phone, a chair, and a few shelves filled with dusty ancient books that probably hadn't been touched in decades. I didn't bother with them. The only thing I needed to focus on was the gate. As the hours passed, the weight of isolation sank deeper into my bones. I could feel the cold creeping under my skin, making me itch and twitch. I walked the perimeter of the gate every so often, not out of necessity, but out of fear that something might happen if I didn't keep moving. But no matter where I stood, the silence would return, pressing in from every side. It was about an hour before midnight when I first heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder with every passing second. The words were impossible to make out, but they were there, just beyond the reach of understanding. They didn't sound human. They didn't even sound like any language I recognized. The whispers seemed to swirl around the gate, slipping through the bars like mist brushing against my ears. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was rule number 2. The bell would toll at midnight, and I wasn't supposed to look into the shadows. I had to focus. I had to remember the rules, but the whispering, it was getting louder, closer. I turned away from the gate, forcing myself to walk back toward the cabin. The shadows seemed to stretch with every step, inching closer to me, threatening to swallow me whole. I could feel them moving, even though I was no longer looking directly at them. Every time I glanced back, I saw something dark, just beyond the light. It was like the shadows were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then, it happened. The bell tolled. 1, 2, 3 times. I couldn't breathe. I felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs, leaving only the ringing sound of the bell in my ears. The darkness around me seemed to grow deeper with each toll, stretching further, pulling at the edges of my vision. I had to turn away. I had to keep my gaze straight ahead. The rules told me not to look, not to give in to the temptation to see what lay beyond. But something in the shadows wanted me to look. It called to me, a voice like a siren song, irresistible and cold. I felt its pull, the weight of it pressing against my chest. Trying to drag my eyes back to the gate, I stood there, paralyzed by fear, my body frozen in place. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but the rules, those damn rules, kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't break them. I wouldn't. The whispers died down as the bell's final toll faded into the night. The silence that followed was even worse than before, thick, suffocating. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond my line of sight, lurking in the shadows. I turned toward the cabin, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. But before I could step inside, I heard it again, the scrape. It was slow, deliberate, dragging along the ground like a heavy object being pulled across the earth. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear or something larger, that had wandered too close to the gate, but the sound was too calculated, too unnatural. The scrape continued, steady, rhythmic, closer, closer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The curiosity gnawed at me. What was making that noise? I had to know. I was supposed to be guarding the gate, wasn't I? But what if I looked? What if I just peeked? Number, I couldn't break the rules. Not yet. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breath. The darkness around me seemed to press in tighter, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to flee. But I stayed. The scraping stopped suddenly. In its place, there was a new sound. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking along the gravel road that led up to the gate. 1 step, 2 steps. Each footfall was heavier than the last, as if the person, no, the thing, was getting closer, closer to me. I couldn't see them. I couldn't hear them clearly, but I could feel them, their presence growing like a storm in the distance. The rules flashed through my mind again, but they seemed so distant now, so insignificant compared to what was happening. I should have been focusing on the gate. I should have been waiting, standing guard like I was supposed to. But the footsteps kept coming. The phone on the desk rang suddenly, its shrill sound cutting through the night like a knife. I jumped, startled, but before I could move, the ringing stopped. I felt the blood drain from my face. No one else should have been there. I hadn't even seen another car. That was when the voice came. It was faint at first, just a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. John, my heart stopped. I froze. I didn't move. I couldn't move. It was a voice, calling my name from beyond the gate. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it was unmistakable. And I remembered rule number 5. If you hear someone calling your name from beyond the gate, do not respond. I stood there, motionless, my mind racing. The voice was faint, distant, but it was real. So real. My name echoed in the air like a promise, but the rule, I couldn't break the rule. But what if it wasn't a rule? What if the voice was real? What if it was someone out there needing help? I stepped back slowly, every nerve on edge. I didn't look toward the gate. I couldn't. The shadows were still out there, waiting, watching. And I remembered. I had to follow the rules. I had no choice. I turned, finally stepping back into the cabin, closing the door behind me. The silence was unbearable, but I couldn't escape the dread that lingered in the air. I had obeyed. I had resisted. But I knew then that I wasn't safe. I was never going to be safe here. Not as long as I kept guarding the gate. The night stretched on, and the shadows were still waiting. The moon was barely visible through the thick clouds that rolled across the sky, leaving the night darker than it had been before. It was almost as though the world was holding its breath, and the only sound was the rustle of the wind against the leaves. The gate, looming like a sentinel, stood motionless in front of me, an iron giant in the night, heavy with secrets I was beginning to understand far too well. The hours had dragged on since I last heard the scraping, the whispers, and the tolling bell. I'd convinced myself that I could still endure this, just a few more hours. I didn't know what time it was. Time had ceased to matter here. But the unsettling silence that had fallen over the place was the calm before a storm, and I could feel it in my bones. It came without warning. A figure appeared at the edge of the road, a silhouette barely visible against the thick swirling fog. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the shadows, my mind playing games with me. But as it drew closer, the figure became clearer, and I saw that it was a man, tall and thin, moving with purpose, his footsteps silent against the gravel. His face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but there was something about him, something unsettling in the way he moved. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't right. I remembered rule number 3 immediately. Never make contact with the people who come to the gate. The man didn't pause as he approached. He didn't knock, didn't make a sound, except for the soft shuffling of his shoes against the gravel. He came right up to the gate and stopped, standing there as though waiting for something, or perhaps someone. I stayed where I was, frozen. My eyes never left him, and for a moment I thought about retreating into the cabin, locking the door behind me and pretending I hadn't seen him. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt too thick, and there was a strange pull toward the gate, like gravity itself had shifted. And then he spoke. John Blackwell. His voice was low, almost a whisper, carried by the wind, but unmistakable. I've been waiting for you. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. How did he know my name? I'd never seen him before in my life, and yet his voice, so calm, so certain, made my blood run cold. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I was supposed to ignore him. That was the rule. Don't make contact. But the words hung in the air, and I felt my feet move before I even thought to stop them. There was something about this man, something that felt like an inevitability, as though his presence was part of some grand plan I hadn't yet understood. I stepped forward, cautiously. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice betraying more fear than I wanted it to. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, staring at me with eyes I couldn't see, his face hidden in shadow. "You don't need to know who I am," he finally said, his voice low and strangely calming. "But I've come to speak with you about what's beyond that gate." The words struck me like a thunderclap. "Beyond the gate?" I repeated, but it sounded like a question I didn't want answered. "Do you truly believe you're just guarding a gate?" he asked, his tone almost knowing. "The gate is more than just iron and stone. It is a threshold, John, a doorway, a passage. It guards more than you think." I felt a lump form in my throat. The gate. Of course, I knew there was something strange about it, but I had never let myself truly consider it, never allowed myself to entertain the idea that the gate held more than just the job I had been given, more than just a solitary night in the cold. But this man's words, they carried an unsettling weight. What did he know that I didn't? And why was he here, speaking to me now? I opened my mouth to ask him to explain, but before I could, he took a step back. His form blurred for a moment, as if the fog itself was swallowing him up. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering me, measuring my reaction. "I can't tell you everything," he said. "Not yet. But remember this, John. There are things beyond that gate, things far older than you, older than this place. The gate keeps them out. It always has." I felt my pulse quicken. "Keeps them out? From where?" I asked, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began to walk away. His steps were slow but deliberate, like he was disappearing into the darkness without a trace. His form dissolved into the night, swallowed by the fog. It was as though he hadn't been there at all. One moment, he was standing right in front of me, and the next, he was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty road, my mind racing to process what had just happened. Who was he? What had he meant by things beyond the gate? Was it a warning? Or was it something worse, something I wasn't supposed to know? I didn't have time to think it through. A cold gust of wind slammed into me, and I could feel the air around me grow even colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a terrible mistake by speaking to him. I had broken rule number 3, and I wasn't sure what the consequences would be. But I felt them coming. I could feel the shadows gathering once more. I turned toward the cabin, the fear gnawing at my insides. I wasn't sure what I expected to find in there. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But all I could think about was the man's cryptic words, echoing in my mind like a drumbeat. The gate keeps them out. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me, the sound of it reverberating in the silence. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't feel alone anymore. Something had changed. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. The days began to blur together, a never-ending cycle of silence, whispers, and shadows. The tension in the air had thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on my chest. Every hour, every minute, felt like it was stretching into infinity. The once calm isolation of the gate had become an oppressive prison, suffocating me with its unnatural stillness. It wasn't just the atmosphere anymore. Something was changing. Something beyond the gate was stirring. The first sign came on the fourth night. I'd been pacing the small cabin, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching me. I kept glancing nervously toward the gate, as though I could feel its presence even through the thick walls. But I couldn't escape it. The gate was there, like an ominous sentinel waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. And then, the gate began to hum. It was so faint at first that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. A low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth, reverberating through the ground and into my bones. But it grew louder, like a heartbeat, slow and steady. Something was trying to get through. I didn't know what. I didn't want to know. I stood by the window, staring out at the gate, trying to see if anything had changed. But the night was thick with fog, and all I could make out were the shifting shadows that swirled around the gate. It was like the darkness itself had taken on a life of its own, coiling and twisting like smoke, moving in unnatural ways. The hum grew louder, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. I looked at the list of rules on the desk. Rule number 1, never leave the gate unguarded. I was already doing that, standing here, watching the strange phenomenon unfold before me. Rule number 2, do not look into the shadows, was a reminder that I wasn't supposed to understand what was happening. The shadows were not for me to look at. They were not for me to understand. But I was already failing. A cry echoed through the night. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more desperate. The sound was human, but twisted, a scream for help, a pleading cry. It came from beyond the gate. I didn't know what to make of it. It sounded real. It sounded human. But there was something about it, something wrong, something distorted. It was as though the cry was being warped by the very air itself. And then it was joined by laughter, high-pitched and maniacal. A laugh that sent chills down my spine, like nails on a chalkboard. The sound crawled under my skin, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. What was beyond the gate? I had never questioned it before. I had followed the rules, I had stayed in line, but now the rules felt like a prison. They felt like chains that were tightening around my throat. The rules were meant to keep me safe, to protect me from what lay beyond the gate. But what if they were just keeping me ignorant? What if there was something I needed to see, something I needed to understand before it was too late? The thought consumed me, gnawing at my sanity. What if I could open the gate, just for a moment? What harm could there be in seeing what was on the other side? I couldn't stop myself. I walked toward the gate, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't do it. I knew I was breaking the rules. But the curiosity, the need to understand, it was too much. The man's words echoed in my mind. The gate keeps them out. But who were they? What were they? I reached for the lock, my fingers trembling as I turned it. The gate creaked loudly as it began to open, the sound echoing across the silent night. The hum from beyond the gate grew louder, vibrating in the air, filling my ears with an unbearable pressure. I took a step back, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. At first, nothing did. The fog was thick, rolling in waves over the ground. The shadows stretched out before me, but I couldn't see anything clearly. It was like peering into a void, but I could feel it, the presence on the other side. It was watching me. It was waiting for me. And then The darkness began to shift. The shadows moved on their own, twisting and contorting like serpents, stretching toward me as if trying to break free from their confinement. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath rising in the pale moonlight. I felt a pull, a deep, gnawing terror in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to close the gate, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by what I was seeing, or rather, by what I wasn't seeing. Suddenly, a shadow lunged at me. It wasn't just a movement, it was a force, a wave of darkness that surged forward, faster than I could react. I tried to slam the gate shut, but it was too late. The shadow reached for me, and I felt a cold, burning sensation as it brushed against my skin. My entire arm felt like it was being scorched, a searing pain that made me gasp in agony. I slammed the gate shut with all my strength, the lock falling into place with a sharp clink. The shadow withdrew, but the pain didn't fade. My hand burned, the skin blackened and blistered where the shadow had touched it. I fell to my knees, clutching my wrist as the pain intensified, a wave of nausea rising in my throat. I tried to catch my breath, to steady myself, but the world around me spun. The laughter from beyond the gate continued, echoing in the distance like a reminder of my failure. I had broken the rules. I had opened the gate, and something had marked me. The coldness in my hand spread up my arm like it was crawling under my skin. I looked down and saw the strange markings, dark and twisted, appearing on my skin like a brand. They pulsed with a faint light, as though they were alive. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was a blur of panic and confusion. What had I done? What was beyond the gate? What had I just let in? The shadows, the cries, the laughter, they all felt like a warning that I had just triggered something terrible, something that had been locked away for too long. And now, it was coming for me. I stumbled to my feet, backing away from the gate, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The markings on my skin burned. I could feel them pulsing, spreading across my body, like they were slowly taking control of me. I had broken the rules, and now I had to pay the price. Time had lost all meaning. I'd been guarding the gate for what felt like weeks, though it could have been days, or perhaps even months. The hours blended together in a haze of dread, anxiety, and regret. Every day, the same oppressive silence surrounded me. Every night, the whispers grew louder, the shadows more restless. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, that something inside me was shifting, like a dam about to break. The markings on my hand had not faded. In fact, they had spread. They crawled up my arm, twisting and coiling around my skin like some ancient cursed symbol. They burned constantly, a reminder of the mistake I had made, but worse, of the consequences I was still facing. And with every passing day, they grew stronger, more pronounced, like a brand that refused to be ignored. But it wasn't just the pain of the markings that haunted me. It was the realization that everything I had been told was a lie. The job, the rules, the employer, it was all part of a bigger plan, a game I had unknowingly entered, and now there was no way out. The realization hit me one evening as I sat by the gate, watching the shifting darkness. The hum was back, louder now, vibrating through the ground, making the very air feel alive. And then, as if on cue, I heard the voice again, the man's voice, calm and detached. "You should have never opened the gate." I turned around, my heart racing, but no one was there. The shadows stretched and moved, their edges curling like fingers reaching out for me. I was alone, but I wasn't. I was being watched. The truth came to me like a flood. The gate wasn't just a barrier, it was a portal, a doorway to hell itself. The hum, the cries, the whispers, all of it. It had been a warning, a signal that something ancient and terrible was trying to break through. And the worst part? The worst part was that I had been chosen to guard it. The man in the suit, the one who had hired me, was not human. I had known that instinctively from the beginning, but I hadn't wanted to believe it. His cold, emotionless demeanor, his cryptic words, they were all part of the facade. He was a guardian, just like me, but his allegiance wasn't to humanity. It was to something darker, something that thrived on fear and despair. He had been watching me from the moment I stepped foot on this cursed ground. And now, it was too late. The job wasn't just a test. It was a trap. A test to see who could resist the temptation, who could follow the rules long enough to keep the gate sealed. But there was no escape from this. The gate would never let me go. No one had ever made it out. Everyone before me had either broken the rules, lost their sanity, or worse, been swallowed by the gate itself. The rules weren't just there to protect the world from what lay beyond. They were there to protect me from becoming part of it. They were my lifeline, a fragile barrier between me and the horrors that lurked on the other side. But I had already broken them. I had already crossed the line. I hadn't understood what was at stake until now. The punishment was clear. I had opened the gate. I had looked into the shadows. I had made contact with the stranger. And now the consequences were catching up with me. The creatures from hell were stirring, and the gate had marked me as one of its own. I could feel it now. The pressure, the weight of it all. The shadows were no longer just shifting around me. They were moving closer, reaching for me. Their whispers had turned into voices, low and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but I could feel their malice, their hunger. They were trying to drag me into the darkness, to pull me across the threshold. The gate had always been watching me. And now it was too late to turn back. The horror unfolds. I began to hear them in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing moment, the sounds of scratching, of something clawing at the earth, crawling closer with every second. It was like the very ground beneath me was alive, trying to drag me down into the abyss. I gripped the edge of the gate, my hands slick with sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The hum was almost deafening now, vibrating through the air like a physical force. The ground shook beneath me, and I could feel the energy surging through the earth, pulling at my very soul. It wasn't just the gate that was alive. The whole place, the entire land, was part of the curse, part of the prison that kept the darkness at bay. And then I saw them. Shapes, fleeting at first, barely discernible, but then more solid, more real. The creatures from the other side were beginning to emerge, their twisted, contorted forms slithering from the shadows like serpents, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. They were pulling themselves through the darkness, inch by inch, their mouths dripping with something that wasn't quite blood. The gate was trembling, the very earth beneath my feet quaking with the force of their arrival. I could feel the heat of their presence, the suffocating weight of their malice. And then I heard it, the whisper again. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind me, cold and guttural. "John," I spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing except the shadows. But I could feel them creeping in, tightening around me, suffocating me. The air was thick with a presence I couldn't explain, but I knew what it was. It was coming for me. They were coming for me. I stumbled back, my body shaking with terror. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The gate had claimed me. The creatures from hell were coming, and there was no place to hide. They had always been there, waiting. And now I had become part of the cycle of guard, break the rules, and face the consequences. And each time, the punishment would get worse. The shadows were no longer just shapes in the distance. They were all around me now, whispering my name, pulling at my mind, their voices growing louder, sharper. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. The darkness was closing in, swallowing everything. And then I understood. This wasn't just about the gate. This wasn't just about following the rules. It was about survival. It was about keeping the darkness at bay, holding the gate closed long enough to keep the creatures from escaping. But it was a losing battle. There was no winning. The gate was always going to win. I had made my choice when I opened it, and now the price would be paid. The air in the small cabin felt thicker now, as if it were closing in around me. Each breath seemed to draw in more of the oppressive weight that hung over the place, the pressure of inevitability, of destiny. The gate loomed outside, a silent sentinel, its presence no longer passive. It was as if it had taken on a life of its own, waiting for me to make a decision it had already known I would make. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I had a choice anymore. Time had lost its meaning here. The days blended together into a haze, but now, as I stood before the gate, I could feel the bell tolling in the distance. It was almost like a countdown, the seconds slipping away like sand through my fingers. The tolls had always been a warning, reminding me of the rules, reminding me that the moment I violated them, there would be no going back. But now, those rules had become the very thing that chained me to this place. The rules were more than guidelines. They were my only protection, my only lifeline. I had already broken them all. I had opened the gate, looked into the shadows, made contact with the stranger. Every transgression had pulled me deeper into the darkness. Now, I was standing on the precipice, staring into the unknown, and there was only one more rule. Left leave at sunrise. Do not stay past the morning. That was the one I feared most, the one that hovered over me like a guillotine, its blade waiting to fall. I had stayed longer than I should have, much longer, and I knew, in the deepest recesses of my soul, that the final toll of the bell meant the end of the line. The moment I broke this rule, the gate would claim me. But then, the thought gnawed at me. What if breaking the rule was the only way to escape? The wind howled outside, carrying with it the stench of rot and decay. I could feel it, the darkness beyond the gate, its hungry tendrils stretching toward me. The voices had begun again, faint at first but growing louder. The shadows, no longer just swaying in the night, began to writhe and shift with a life of their own, pulling at the edges of my vision, urging me forward. I couldn't tell whether it was fear or something else, but the desire to understand what lay beyond the gate burned within me. I walked toward the gate, my steps slow but inevitable, like a man walking toward his execution. My fingers brushed against the cold, rusted metal, and for a moment I hesitated. The markings on my skin burned as if in protest, a reminder of the price I had already paid. My hand shook, the weight of the decision pressing down on me with crushing force. I was already broken. What did it matter if I broke the final rule? Was it better to stay in this eternal torment, guarding a gate that I could never leave, or should I open it and let whatever horrors awaited on the other side come to claim me? It seemed like an impossible choice, and yet it was the only one I had left. I took a deep breath and turned the lock. The moment the gate creaked open, the air shifted. The hum, the throbbing vibration I had grown accustomed to, intensified, flooding my senses with a pressure so intense it almost felt physical. The shadows beyond the gate were no longer still. They moved like living things, twisting and stretching, reaching out to me as if they were calling my name. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive, and they were pulling at me, urging me to cross the threshold. "John!" The voice came from beyond, soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. "Come to me." The voice was both familiar and alien, like a memory I couldn't quite grasp. It echoed in my mind, pulling me closer, compelling me to take that final step. I could feel my body moving toward the gate, my feet betraying me, as if they knew the truth I was too afraid to face. The gate, which had always been my responsibility, was no longer something I controlled. It had become the thing that controlled me. It had already marked me, already claimed me. And now I was walking willingly into its embrace. But as I approached the gate, something inside me snapped. The air turned cold, the temperature dropping so quickly that my breath became visible in the air. A deep, bone-chilling cold that sank into my very soul. It was as if the gate itself was a living thing, a maw opening to swallow me whole. I stopped just before crossing the threshold. Was this it? Had I made the right choice? And then I heard it again. The toll of the bell. The sound, so deep and resonant, shook me to my core. It wasn't just a sound. It was a command. The bell had tolled once more, marking the end of everything, the end of my struggle. The shadows seemed to respond, intensifying, coiling tighter around me, urging me to move forward. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to step beyond the gate, not now that I understood what I was about to unleash. And that's when the voice from beyond spoke once more. But this time, it was different. "You're already too late." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I staggered backward, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. It wasn't the voice of the man, nor the shadows, but something else, something older, something powerful. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, the world around me spinning. It was too late. I had already broken the most important rule. The gate had already claimed me, and there was no escaping it. "John," the voice came again, louder this time, as if it were inside my head. The shadows that had once been swirling outside now poured in, filling the space around me, crawling across the walls like they were alive. They were moving with purpose, like creatures on the hunt. I tried to run. I tried to flee, to escape the darkness that had been chasing me since the moment I stepped foot here. But it was too late. The gate had marked me, and now I was its prisoner. The shadows reached out, pulling at my mind, whispering my name. The weight of their presence grew unbearable, the darkness closing in around me, and I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I had never been in control. I had never had a choice. The bell tolled one final time, and everything went black.